Also going to go through some practice questions as well. So I hope that will be a really good, insightful aspect as to what are some of the difficulties of verbal reasoning, how do you overcome those, and how can we help you overcome those particular difficulties. In terms of that, we will also be discussing aspects of timing in verbal reasoning towards the end. We'll be discussing general tips, and we'll also be doing a general Q&A at the end of the session as well. So if possible, please do join in on Menti. Excellent. So starting off, it's very important that we have a general understanding of what the section is and what it's testing you on. Verbal reasoning is one of the more straightforward sections in the UCAT. This section is all about reading a passage of text and then answering questions based on that text. So this section is entirely about verbal comprehension. Some of these questions can be quite similar to questions that you may have done before at school, particularly for things like GCSE English. So because of that, it's not that far away from what you've done previously. In terms of that, the questions themselves can often seem fairly simple. The difficulty of verbal reasoning, and indeed the difficulty that comes into every single section of the UCAT, is the timing. Timing in verbal reasoning is especially tight, and this is the section that people often find the most difficult when it comes to handling the timing and completing every question to the fullest degree. The test has been designed specifically in this way, so it's not a failure at all if you find the timing in verbal reasoning difficult. The reason for this is that the UCAT is, at the end of the day, an aptitude test. In this section, the examiners want to see that you can take in information quickly and effectively, and then answer questions based on that information. So it's all about being able to take it in, understand the information, and answer questions on it in a time-effective manner. Okay. Please do use Menti. This is a very interactive session that we've got planned here. So it gives you the opportunity to ask lots of questions, and it also gives you the opportunity to take part in some questions that we're going to be doing very shortly. The main goal of this is to make sure that you're being heard, so that I can answer any questions that you guys have got, and also to be able to demonstrate to you some of the skills that are necessary for verbal reasoning, and therefore some of the ways that you might want to go about preparing for this section. So if you'd like to, please go to the website and enter the code on screen, and we've also got a QR code up for you as well. Okay. So from yesterday's discussion, we found out that some people have begun preparing for the UCAT or have started having a look at some of the sections of the UCAT. So for those of you who have started looking at things to do with the UCAT, what have you found difficult about verbal reasoning so far? We're having a couple of people coming in to say timing. And absolutely, as we mentioned, that's something that a lot of people find really tricky when it comes to verbal reasoning. As well as that, in order to deal with the timing, it means that you have to understand the subtleties and the nuances of the passage, and you have to do so really quickly. In verbal reasoning, you'll find that you often don't have enough time to fully read through the passage and then answer questions on it. So it means that you have to develop an effective method of taking in the information, but only taking in the useful information for that particular question, which is no mean feat. So as we can see from a lot of the aspects on the screen, a lot of the difficulties relating to verbal reasoning are related to time. As well as that, there are a few other difficulties as well. So having some answers that are relatively misleading and needing to use inferences to be able to answer those types of questions. So on paper, it's quite a simple section, but actually when it comes to doing it under timed conditions and preparing for it, it can be really difficult. And in fact, verbal reasoning tends to have one of the slightly lower average scores per section when it comes to the UCAT. So that's what we're going to be talking about for today's session. As part of that, for those of you who perhaps haven't started preparing yet, or for those of you who have done minimal preparation yet, which is completely fine based on the current timeline, we're going to be going over some questions relating to verbal reasoning. And the reason why we're going to be doing this is, first of all, so that you can have a bit of a go at doing a bit of verbal reasoning and seeing what the sections are like. So for those of you who will be sitting the UCAT, this will be excellent preparation. For parents who have joined this call, this will be a great opportunity to see what your children will be going through in a couple of months' time. And as well as that, this should hopefully highlight to you, again, the challenges of this section and get you to start thinking about how you can overcome those challenges. So we've got 5 questions that we're going to be going over, and those 5 questions are all on different passages. So you have 30 seconds on average per question for verbal reasoning. We're going to start off with this passage here, and then we'll go on through the rest of them. And as we go along, I'll show you what the answers are and explain why the answers were that case. Okay, so this was question 1. So based on the passage that we just saw, if you could answer this question here. Okay, excellent. Congratulations to those of you who said false in this instance. So this passage was all about tuition fees and the role of several parties in education. You will have noticed in the passage that there was a sentence saying that tuition fees are currently set at £9,250 per year. So as a result of that, that directly contradicts this statement here of tuition fees currently being set at 9,000, and that's why the answer here is false. So well done to the majority of you there. Okay, we'll go on to the second question. Okay, so again, we'll be answering a question based on that second passage there. So in this case, the statement that we've been given is magazines relating to football are becoming more popular. So based on this passage, what are your thoughts on that statement? Brilliant. So congratulations to the 94 of you who said true in this instance. You are absolutely correct there. You will have noticed in the third paragraph of that passage, there was a sentence saying that there was a rise in the popularity of football magazines such as 442. Because of that, saying the rise in popularity of football magazines is an alternative way of phrasing this statement: magazines relating to football are becoming more popular. So because there is a direct link between the statement that we've been given and the information in the passage, we can therefore say that this statement is going to be true. So well done to the majority of you who said that is true. We'll go on to a slightly more challenging one in this case. So as you can see here, this passage all about health experts, the NHS, and the role that AI can play in various forms of healthcare. So we'll be going on to our third question here. And the statement that we've been given here is that the article predicts that after 2022, AI could be used to predict cancer survival for the first time. Brilliant. So a slightly bigger mix in terms of the answers here, but well done to those of you who said false in this case. As you would have noticed towards the end of that passage, there was a sentence saying that AI is already being used to predict cancer survival in hospitals. So because we've been told that AI is already being used, that contradicts this statement saying that it could be used to predict cancer survival for the first time. As a result of that contradiction, the answer is therefore false, and that's why 73 of you are correct for that answer. So congratulations. Looking at the leaderboard here, we've got some interesting names coming up there, but congratulations to those of you who have got all questions correct so far. To those of you who have got some of the questions incorrect, that's absolutely normal. Verbal reasoning is a tricky section to get used to doing under time pressures. And part of why we're doing these questions is to demonstrate those time pressures to you as we go through. So don't think that, that it's a bad sign if you haven't got these questions correct or haven't got any questions correct so far. This is something that you can improve with focused practice. We have 2 more questions to go here, and they are slightly more challenging than the 3 that we've done already. So the next section that we're going to be having a look at is this one. This passage is relating to different methods of payment, where those methods of payment are used and the popularity of those. Okay, fantastic. So we've got a really good number of people playing. So thank you for participating so readily here. So the 4th question that we are faced in with here is the majority of people spend above £8 on a contactless transaction. Okay, so 14 of you got that answer correct. So I did warn you that it was going to get slightly more complicated. This question highlights one of the most challenging aspects of verbal reasoning, which is being able to take inferences into account when it comes to these questions. This was something that someone mentioned as one of the difficulties of verbal reasoning beforehand, in terms of really having to understand the information that you've been given in the passages. And the question that we've just done here absolutely demonstrates that. You will have seen in the 2nd paragraph that we were told that the average transaction amount for contactless was £8.60. And quite a few of you, it looks like, have extrapolated that average to mean that the majority of people spend above £8 on contactless transactions, which happens all the time when it comes to tutoring with those questions with my students as well. The main thing to remember in terms of that, if we're thinking about the mathematical concepts we're using there, is that an average doesn't represent a majority. When you're calculating an average, you add all of the total options and then you divide by the number of options that you have added together. As a result of that, you can often get outlying numbers which skew the average to a certain range. So for example, here, if we had 9 out of 10 people spending £3 per contactless transaction, and then you had one person who was spending £40 per contactless transaction, that one person spending £40 is really going to skew the average away from £3. So even though the majority of people are spending £3, the average is going to be much higher than 3 due to that one person who is spending a very different amount. This is why we cannot extrapolate the majority when we're considering an average number that we've been given. And this is why the answer is can't tell in this case. So because we can't extrapolate that data, we cannot say that the answer is true because we don't know that the majority of people are spending above £8. However, we also cannot say that the majority of people aren't spending above £8 because we don't know what that spread is like. We don't know whether there are any outliers in the data because we haven't been told in the passage. And because we're missing that information, the answer is therefore going to be can't tell. When it comes to the UCAT, a lot of people assume that the can't tell answer option represents the answer option that you should choose when you're really confused, which is completely normal. I was the exact same when I was preparing, but the can't tell answer option actually exists across every section in the UCAT to demonstrate when you haven't been given enough information to give one of the other answer options. In this case, we don't have that information, so the answers therefore cannot tell. So congratulations to the 14 people who selected that. That's a really tricky style of question to get. And now we've got one more question to look at as well. So this passage is all relating to things about recycling and waste disposal. Okay, and now I'll show you the question. Brilliant. So congratulations to those of you who gave that first answer. So plastic straws are non-biodegradable. You will have noticed that this was a different question style compared to the previous 4 that we've seen. So the previous 4 questions that we went over were what we call true, false, and can't tell questions. So those are question types where you are given a statement and you're then asked if, based on the passage, that statement itself is true, whether it's false, or whether you can't tell. True, false, and can't tell questions tend to be the easiest types of questions that you can get on verbal reasoning. And unfortunately, as a result of that, they also tend to be the rarest type of question that you can get in verbal reasoning as well. So true, false, and can't tell questions, you will typically get anywhere between 3 to 5 of that question type in verbal reasoning itself. Keeping in mind that you have 44 questions in total for this section, it therefore means that the other 39 to 40 questions that you will get are going to be much trickier. And the reason why they're much trickier is because they'll give you more information to contend with, just like this question here. This type of question that you're seeing on the screen is what we call a type 2 statement question. And the important thing to say there is that each of the answer options themselves is a different statement. Because of that, you now have 4 statements to contend with, as opposed to the 1 statement that you were given for true, false, and can't tell questions. That makes these questions much more difficult, and it means that you're going to spend more time trying to answer them. We've been saying throughout this talk that time in verbal reasoning is already quite sparse and is already quite difficult to manage. As a result of that, it's really important that you are aware of all of the different question types that you can get in verbal reasoning. It's also important to have a strong method for dealing with all of those question types. And that is a method that you are going to have to adapt to those question types. So the way that you would want to go about answering a type 2 statement question that we've got on screen is quite different to the way that you would want to go about answering a true, false, and can't tell question like the previous ones that we were getting. And the time that you would want to spend per question would also probably be slightly different there as well. Excellent. So we can see there that there were 2 people that managed to get all 5 questions correct. So congratulations to the 2 of you. Quite a few people as well managed to get 4 questions correct, which is really good as well. And for those of you who got under that number, you still managed to do really well in terms of taking in all of that information. It's not easy in the slightest, as you will have seen from the questions that we've just done. And that was the point of giving you those questions, was to demonstrate how challenging it can be to work through all that information in such a short amount of time. That's why it's so important to have effective methods that you can put in place. And that's why it's so important to be aware of all of the different question types that you can get. What I often discuss with my students when I'm working through verbal reasoning with them is that you need to have an action plan for every possible situation that could come up in verbal reasoning and in the rest of the UCAT as well. And that includes all of the different question types, understanding the methods for how to answer them, and also understanding how to adapt those methods based on how you're doing in the section. So for example, if you're running a little bit behind in the section overall, how are you going to adapt your method for answering the questions so that you can then catch up and still be able to finish every question in the section? So in terms of how you all found that, thank you so much for taking part in those 5 questions, by the way. It becomes a lot easier to deliver these types of sessions when you have so many people interacting. So we managed to get some fantastic numbers taking part in that. So really, thank you. Thank you for doing so. A lot of you will have found that very difficult, and that's completely natural. When I was first preparing for the UCAT, I found answering the questions without any time pressure difficult, let alone answering questions within the around 28 seconds per question that you've got in verbal reasoning. So it is very challenging. You have 44 questions to answer in the 21 minutes that you've got for verbal reasoning. One of the important things to mention there is that you do get 4 questions per passage. So you get 11 passages in total. In terms of the questions that we just went over, I showed you 5 different passages when it came to that. And so because of that, one of the difficulties that you probably faced in those questions was having to get used to an entirely new set of information for each of those question types. One of the good things about having 4 questions per passage is that it means that the first couple of questions for that passages you might find fairly challenging. However, questions 3 and 4 in that passage, you will probably find a little bit easier because of the fact that you've just spent at least a minute or so answering questions on that same passage. So there are lots of tips and tricks like that that you can use to be able to better acquaint yourself with the information and therefore be able to answer questions in a quicker way. Great. So what we're now going to do is discuss some general tips that we can use when it comes to verbal reasoning. So the first tip is to use a keyword technique. We mentioned previously that you don't have enough time to be able to read through or every single passage and every single word in every single passage as well. As a result of that, what you need to use is a form of technique that allows you to pick out the relevant information in the passage based on the question that you're being asked. The best way to do that is to use the keyword technique that we've pioneered. You can find information about this on our UCAT blogs. You can also find information about this on our YouTube channel as well. But the key aspect of that keyword technique is that it allows you to pick out the relevant information for that question. And because of that, it means that you don't have to spend lots of time picking out that information. The second tip there is to make sure that you identify extreme language. So extreme language is when they use words like longest, shortest, biggest, smallest. So typically these superlative words that indicate that there's no other possible or conceivable option when it comes to that particular item that they're discussing. The reason why this is so important is that statements that include extreme language are often more likely to be a false or cannot tell answer. So it doesn't guarantee it, but it does make the answer more likely to be one of those two options. And that can be really useful when it comes to narrowing down your choices and ultimately picking your answer. It's really important to not spend too long checking in the verbal reasoning questions. As we just mentioned, you've got 28 seconds per question when it comes to verbal reasoning. So that doesn't give you enough time to double check each of your answers, or sometimes to double check any of your answers. As a result of that, there is an element of just being confident in the answers that you're selecting, and also making sure that you're keeping the overall time of the section in the back of your mind as you're going through these questions. What you don't want to do is to spend some time answering a question, double check that you've got that answer correct, and then because of the time that you've spent double checking that answer, you're then not able to use that time to answer several more questions. So part of the strategy when it comes to these types of sections is making sure that you're thinking of the bigger picture. So if I spend X amount of time on this question in front of me, how is that going to affect my ability to answer the remaining questions that I have in the section? If you can think in this manner, it's really helpful for coming up with effective timing tips. And ultimately, that's one of the best ways to ensure that you have good timing overall for the section. Practicing in a library can be really helpful when it comes to the UCAT. That can help you to be kind of situated in those testing environments, which is really useful. When you sit the UCAT exam, you'll be taking the exam in a local test centre, which often has quite similar resources to what a library can provide. And as well as that, you also want to get used to working around other people. So when you sit your UCAT exam, there will also be other people in the different pods around you who are sitting various tests. So they might be doing the UCAT as well. They might be doing a driving theory test, for example. But it's important to get used to sitting UCAT questions while there are other people clicking and working around you so that you can get used to those types of environments. As well as that, it's important to get used to working on screens. I know a lot of people prepare for the UCAT by using preparatory paper resources. So there's quite a few UCAT books that you can use. The books are really useful for being able to see lots of different types of questions, but the difficulty of the books are that is not the medium that you're going to be sitting the UCAT on when you actually do the exam. When you do the exam, it is going to be on a desktop computer with a full keyboard. And as a result of that, in your preparation, you want to make sure that you are mimicking the environment and the resources that you will have on the day as much as possible. So you want to be able to work on a full screen as much as you can, because that's what you're going to get on the day. That's what you're going to be reading your passage off when it comes to verbal reasoning. And so that's what you want to be able to pick out when you come to doing these questions. Try not to fall for some of the time traps that the UCAT will give you. Often the UCAT question writers will include questions in the tests that are too difficult to do in the time that you've been allocated. So again, we've mentioned that you have 28 seconds on average per question for verbal reasoning. There will be some questions that you get in verbal reasoning which will be very challenging to be able to do in 28 seconds. As a result of that, it's important to try not to fall for those time traps. A lot of students will then spend far too much time attempting to answer that question. And if they spend over 28 seconds trying to answer that question, that will then have a knock-on effect on the following questions that they will have time to answer. So it's really important not to fall for the time traps that the UCAT provides you with. And it's also really important to get used to this concept as well. So this is, for most people sitting this exam, the first exam where they will be given these types of time traps. And so because of that, it's really important to integrate that into your timing strategy for verbal reasoning, as well as some of the other sections. Skim reading is one of the most important skills that you can have when it comes to verbal reasoning. We've mentioned the effectiveness of the keyword technique, so picking out certain keywords from the passage and then using those keywords to help answer the question. In order to pick out those keywords effectively, you have to be able to pick them out from the passage in a time-oriented manner. And the best way to do that is to skim read. So that is a crucial skill that you need to be able to develop over the course of your preparatory period, is skim reading. Something that I did when I was preparing that I found quite useful was I would find articles online. Typically, I'd go on something like BBC Health just to make them health oriented. I would ask a family member to pick out a certain keyword for me, and I would then practice skimming through the article until I could find that keyword effectively. And the benefit of doing that is that it practices skim reading, and it also practices skim reading again on a computer screen, which is important. So quite a few of you, particularly those of you who are avid readers, might be really good at skim reading on paper, but it's also important to translate that skill over to screens as well. Hence why doing something like that, that practice can be so useful. And practice is the name of the game here. So practice, practice, practice. The important thing is to be comfortable with the theory in verbal reasoning. So make sure that you're comfortable with all of the different question types and how to answer them. You can then start practicing doing the questions. And in a little bit, we'll talk about where and how you can practice for verbal reasoning. And you want to make sure that you're practicing with intent. So focus on a particular question type, focus on your ability to skim read, focus on your keyword technique. Make sure that when you are practicing, you have a particular skill or topic that you are trying to get better at. I always recommend not starting out with timed questions to begin with. The reason for that is that it's very difficult to go from no support to doing verbal reasoning questions in 28 seconds per question. It's very difficult to integrate those types of time pressures. What I typically recommend is starting off by giving yourself a time pressure, but not one which is so expensive like 28 seconds per question. So what I'll usually work through with my students is I'll say, start off by doing a minute per question. Once you're comfortable with a minute per question, work down to 50 seconds per question. Once you're comfortable with 50 seconds per question, go to 45. Once you're comfortable with 45, you can go to 40, and you can keep working down incrementally until you are at the 28 seconds per question that you've got for verbal reasoning. I always use the analogy of running a marathon. If you're going to run a marathon, you're not going to go out tomorrow and run it, but instead you're going to slowly build up your stamina and your ability to do so in that time until you can run that marathon. And the exact same concept applies when it comes to verbal reasoning, and the same concept applies when it comes to the other sections as well. So be aware of the time that you have per question, work your way down to that time per question, making sure that as you go along, you understand all the different question types and the techniques that you can use to answer those question types. Fantastic. Those are the general tips that we have for verbal reasoning. Using these tips can be a really good way of increasing your score and increasing your ability to deal with the time pressures of the section. And now it comes to how we can help you. MedicMind have been helping students for a number of years now when it comes to preparing for the UCAT. and when it comes to increasing your ability to work under these time pressures. And there are a number of ways that we can support you in doing so. The first and the most popular way that we support students when it comes to the UCAT is through one-to-one tutoring. So we've got thousands of UCAT questions available with award-winning strategies that we ourselves have developed for various types of UCAT questions. So this goes beyond just verbal reasoning, but to the other sections as well. All of our tutors are required to have scored within the top 10% of the exam for the year that they sat the UCAT. So as a result of that, our tutors have a really solid understanding of the difficulties of the UCAT and how to do well at the UCAT. As well as that, all of our tutors are required to have previous tutoring experience as well, which means that they not only understand how to do well at this exam, but they understand how to teach how to do well at this exam. And we can personalize these sessions to the students' strengths and weaknesses. So this is where the benefit of one-to-one tutoring comes in. So we can make sure that we're teaching in such a way that addresses that particular student's limitations in a way that they find easy to understand. That involves giving regular progress updates to both students and parents, and it also involves the use of online materials for the UCAT as well. When it comes to verbal reasoning, we have 17 different tutorials that cover the different question types and how to answer them. So we start off by going through some of the most simple question types, so true, false, and can't tell, developing the ability to spot things like extreme language and spot the inferences within those passages, developing the keyword approach, and also making sure to understand how to adapt that keyword approach for all of the different types of questions. And you can see on there that some of the main types of questions involve writer questions, those type 1 and type 2 tricky statement questions that we came across earlier, as well as reverse questions as well, which is when they will ask you a question which is phrased in a negative format. And with this, we can create a personalized UCAT lesson plan that can help you to establish what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses, and make sure that we're working on those weaknesses to make sure that you are as well-rounded and comfortable with the exam as possible. We also have an online course that we've prepared, which can be really helpful when it comes to doing independent practice for the UCAT. And this is included in any packages of over 20 hours of one-to-one tutoring. I'll play a short video just to describe what the online course is like and how it can help you. Excellent. So yeah, so the online course is a fantastic way of integrating what you can go over in the one-to-one sessions and then putting that into practice with independent revision. It includes a bank of over 8,000 questions, and it's also got over 100 short videos going over the types of topics that you will go over in greater depth in the one-to-one sessions. As mentioned there, we've got plenty of reviews to suggest how helpful these types of resources can be. So if you would like to look at any of those, please do look up our accounts on Trustpilot. They can be really helpful for just seeing how we've helped other people. It's always a pleasure to hear back from previous students and hear about how they've done in the UCAT, how they've done for their personal statements, for their interviews, hearing back from students that have got into medical school as well. And we really do enjoy getting that feedback and then using that to refine our own practices. We do help with every other aspect of the application as well. So as we just mentioned, personal statement and interview tutoring as well is something that we can also do, and we can target those to the universities you're interested in. We are also offering work experience programs as well. I went through the arduous task myself of trying to sort out work experience in several different locations. And it can be really difficult. And so this program was designed with that in mind, to give you lots of knowledge in a practical setting that you can then use and discuss when it comes to your personal statement and when it comes to your interviews as well. If you'd like to find out more, you can find all the information relating to these services on our website. So medicmind.co.uk. You can find information on the one-to-one tutoring, on the online resources that we provide, as well as the work experience placement that we've got that's available as well. And this applies for both people who are applying for medicine as well as those that are applying dentistry. We have work experience cases and programs for both, and we've also helped thousands of students for both of those application processes. For those of you who want to join medicine, feel free to join our WhatsApp group there. We'll be sending in lots of free resources and tips into those WhatsApp groups, so they can be a really helpful way of keeping up with us and gaining as many tips as possible for every single aspect of the application process. So we've got the QR code there for those of you applying to medicine. And then we've also got a WhatsApp group available for those of you who will be applying for dentistry as well. Again, we'll be sending plenty of free resources and tips into those groups. It's a really helpful way of gaining as much knowledge as possible when it comes to such a difficult application process. So we'd really recommend joining those groups so that we can keep supporting you. Brilliant. We've also got free resources when it comes to supporting students as well. And this is really important to us in making sure that we're helping as many people as possible. So we have over 500 free practice questions on our website, and you can find those again at medicmind.co.uk. There are also lots of excellent practice questions on the official UCAT website as well. And those questions can be specific to verbal reasoning, and you can also find mock tests available there too. So that's another really helpful resource to go and find. We have a UCAT blog where we give lots of useful tips on various aspects of the UCAT, including on verbal reasoning. And we've also got a YouTube channel as well, where we're posting very informative, digestible videos on different elements of the UCAT. And that can be really helpful in terms of getting in some of that information in a verbal and visual medium, as opposed to just reading it in a book, for example. Excellent. If you've enjoyed this talk, if you found it useful, please do feel free to leave us a review in terms of what you thought about the webinar, what we've done well, and how we can improve. It can be really helpful for us in making sure that we're supporting you as much as possible. So we want to make sure that we understand what we're doing right and anything that we could improve on. So I'll leave this up for a little bit now. I'll also come back to this later. In a few moments, we'll be finishing off with a Q&A. So if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask, please do log on to the Menti now and input the code. And then I'll be spending the last 10 minutes or so just answering all the questions that we've got. But in the meantime, if you do have the ability, if you are free, please do feel free to leave us a review. We would really appreciate it. Okay, so finishing off with a Q&A. So this, ideally, it can be verbal reasoning related, but if you do have any other general questions, then we can answer those as well. So the one-to-one tutoring varies in terms of the price per hour. It depends on which package you'd like to go for with us. We've got lots of really helpful packages that we can apply to the particular situation that you're in with the UCAT. If you'd like to find out a little bit more, please feel free to give us a call on the number that I'll put up on the screen afterwards. And also feel free to send us an email as well, and we can send you all of the information and our packages. Does MedicMind help with the HPAT exam? We do, yes. I won't go into any more depth in that at the moment, but as we mentioned previously, feel free to give us a call, feel free to send us an email, and we can send you some information on how we can help with that. Where can we access the recording? So thank you for providing the information such as your email in terms of signing up to this. We'll be sending you access to the recording following this session. So you'll be able to watch it back and go over what we've done already. Do you have to manage your own time, or does it auto change in the exam? That's an excellent question. So it will auto change as you go through the sections. What you'll see is in the top right corner of the screen, it will show you the remaining time that you've got for the entire section. So it won't show you any particular time per question. So that's something that you'll have to keep in mind yourself. What I typically recommend to my students is to keep a rough idea of halfway through the section, how many questions have they done and how many more have they got left to go. So verbal reasoning is 21 minutes. I typically recommend to my students with 10 minutes left for them to have a look at how many questions they've done. Halfway through verbal reasoning, it's 44 questions. So you should have 22 questions left with around 10 minutes to go, or around 20 questions left, in fact. If you have more than 20 questions, it means that you need to try and speed up. If you have fewer than 20 questions, it means that you've done a really good job of managing your time. And as a result, you can take your time a little bit more with the remaining questions. So it will move you straight on to the next section following the time running out. But it is on you to make sure that the time per question is being dealt with effectively. And so that's something that you can focus on in your preparation. In terms of getting better at timing, as we said, it's really important to work your way down the levels of timing incrementally. So making sure that you don't jump in at the deep end with 28 seconds per question, but start off with a minute or so and work your way down. As well as that, you want to make sure that you're continuously revising over the theory of the questions. So if there's a question type that you haven't done in a couple of days and you forget how to answer it, that can be really detrimental to the amount of time that you spend answering that question. So continuously revise the theory, make sure that you are comfortable inside and out with the different types of questions and how to answer them. Go down that timing scale incrementally. If you run out of time, you run out of time. One of the most important things in the UCAT is making sure that you don't let your performance in one of the previous sections affect your following sections. Verbal reasoning is the first section that you'll get in the UCAT. It's really detrimental to your overall performance if you then get increasingly worried after verbal reasoning and allow that to affect your next section, which will be decision making. So it's vital that you treat each section as independently as possible. And if you run out of time on that section, then hopefully you won't run out of time on the following sections. If I could change anything about my application, what would it be? I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure that I would have changed anything in terms of that. I was really happy with my selections. I was really happy to go to UEA. That was my first choice medical school. I was happy with my UCAT score. I didn't sit the DMAT exam because I was so happy with the UCAT that I'd achieved. So potentially sitting the BMAT, but in the end, it was good enough to achieve some offers from some really good medical schools. So I think potentially making sure that I was really clued up on all of the medical schools and what they're looking for is a really useful way of preparing. So we've got an online university comparison tool that you can use to see what each of the medical schools are asking from their candidates. And you can also speak to one of our university consultants as well, if you'd like some more specific guidance in terms of which medical schools to apply to. So that might be the one thing that I would change there. In terms of how to skim read, so we mentioned previously a way of developing that skill, and really it's just about practicing it. It's not a skill that comes easily to some people, so it's really important that you continuously try to practice your ability to skim read. The idea is that you're looking out for certain words and you want to be skim reading with intent. So you want to make sure that as you are watching or going through the passage, that you are not taking in information aimlessly, but you're doing so in a focused manner. There are lots of people out there that will try and skim read through questions, but they're not really looking for anything. And as a result of that, they end up having to skim read the passage 2 to 3 times just to pick out a certain bit of information. So reading and skimming with intent is absolutely vital when it comes to picking out that information effectively. In terms of where do you book the UCAT test, you can do so on the official UCAT website. Booking for the UCAT test isn't open until the kind of middle or so of June. I want to say it's the 20th of June is the date that you can start booking the UCAT test from, and it will be the 10th of July that you can start sitting the UCAT from. So it's through the official UCAT website, and you can find all of the dates and all of the information on there. In terms of all of the different types of verbal reasoning questions, we saw some of the main ones today. So you can generally separate verbal reasoning question types into true, false, and can't tell, where the answer options are, as it suggests, true, false, and can't tell. And you've also got statement questions as well, which is where the answer options are in the form of statements. The main thing to say there are that the true, false, and can't tell questions are generally easier and quicker to answer because you're only dealing with one statement at a time, whereas the statement questions themselves are a bit more difficult. As a result of that, when you're picking out information from the passage, for a true, false, and can't tell question, you're only going to have to pick out a small amount of information because you're likely only going to have one statement that you're dealing with. Whereas for the statement question that we saw, we had 4 different statements that were answer options. So you would have to potentially pick out 4 sets of information to be able to guarantee which answer is correct. That's why they're so difficult. That's why you need to have different methods for working through the different questions that you can get. How long would I spend on each section coming up to the UCAT exam is a really good question. And I think it depends on which sections you find you're most comfortable with. Because the sections test you on such different skills, you will naturally find that there are some that you are more inclined to do well at. So for example, I've always dealt much better with words than I have done with diagrams. As a result of that, I always found verbal reasoning much easier to answer as opposed to abstract reasoning. Because of that, it meant that throughout my preparation, I was much more comfortable with verbal reasoning. And so I would need to spend more time focusing on abstract reasoning. So the UCAT is an exam that really punishes people that are not working on their weaknesses and are instead only focusing on their strengths. Being well-rounded is one of the best ways to ensure that you have a UCAT score that you're comfortable with. So my advice would be to maximize the time that you're spending on the sections that you find the most difficult, whichever section that might be, but also still make sure that you're doing enough work to top up your knowledge and ability to answer the sections that you do find really good. So it's just about finding that balance between going over all of the sections, but focusing on the ones that you find the most challenging. Do I recommend Medify? I think Medify is a really useful resource. It depends. I've spoken to some people who found it really useful. I've spoken to some people who have just found it quite useful to use. One of the aspects of Medify that can be helpful is that it can show you how much time you've spent per question. And that is a really useful aspect of that. The majority of the students that we've worked with previously have used a combination of Medify and the online course with the 8,000 plus questions that we've provided. And they found that to be one of the best ways of preparing independently. And then what they'll do is they'll take any questions that they're confused about to their tutor, and they can go over those questions in a one-to-one format. So I think Medify can be really helpful. The best way to revise verbal reasoning. So the main thing is to be aware of all of the different question types, be aware of the different techniques that you need to use to answer those question types. So making sure that you are using that keyword technique to pick out the most important information, and then making sure that you are answering the questions eventually in a time-oriented format. You don't want to go into sitting the UCAT without having done any time-pressured questions, because you will find it very challenging to assimilate into that type of environment. So you really want to make sure that you're comfortable with those types of questions there. So we've got a couple of minutes remaining. So I'll just put this QR code up again for leaving us a review, if that would be possible. Thank you all so much for attending today. It's been a pleasure working with you and giving you some tips on verbal reasoning. Thank you so much as well for participating in the questions that we did at the beginning. I hope that this has been useful for you. Please do leave us any feedback possible, and we hope that you have a lovely rest of your week. In terms of that, we are going to be doing further sections in the following days. So we'll be having more webinars relating to the different sections of the UCAT. And we've also got more webinars going on for those of you who are interested in other application processes, such as the Oxbridge application process. So we can help you and guide you in that as well. So thank you very much. Have a lovely evening.